Defund the Police has become a rallying cry for Black Lives Matter activists and attendees of the George Floyd Protests. To a certain extent, the Minneapolis City Council was responding to these demands when it resolved to dissolve the Minneapolis Police Department. But the picture is far more complicated. The Defund the Police slogan has at the same time become controversial in progressive circles and used as a wedge issue for the Trump campaign, despite the fact that his opponent, Joe Biden, has repeatedly articulated that he does not support the movement. Clearly, this three-word phrase is causing a lot of confusion. So why are some activists calling for the police to be defunded, and what exactly does that mean? Calls to defund the police have been made in protests around the country, and Donald Trump has clearly heard them. The president tweeted, "The train to defund the police has left the station, and Joe Biden is on it. Biden's allies have signaled their support for the effort. Yet again, Biden is kneeling to leftists no matter how dangerous and radical this proposition is." Kind of funny to identify AOC and Rashida Tlaib as Biden allies, but you get the point. It's clear that Trump and his campaign have identified this as a wedge issue, a policy discussion that he believes will benefit his bid for re-election. Indeed, they're probably not wrong. But does Biden actually want to defund the police? No. In fact, he is essentially calling for the opposite. In his op-ed in USA Today, Joe Biden specifically titles a section of the piece, "Don't Defund the Police, Support Reforms." Biden goes on to write, "While I do not believe federal dollars should go to police departments violating people's rights or turning to violence as the first resort, I do not support defunding police. The better answer is to give police departments the resources they need to implement meaningful reforms and to condition other federal dollars on completing those reforms. I've long been a firm believer in the power of community policing, getting cops out of their cruisers and building relationships with the people in the communities they are there to serve and protect. That's why I'm proposing an additional $300 million to reinvigorate community policing in our country." He repeated calls for reforms rather than defunding on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, arguing, "I don't believe police should be defunded, but I think the conditions should be placed upon them where departments are having to take significant reforms relating to that. We should set up a use of force standard." Biden's calls for reforms rather than defunding actually puts him, roughly speaking, in the same position as the president on this specific issue, who likewise does not support defunding, but has made some mild calls for reform. Trump told Fox News that he might make very strong recommendations to local authorities. In particular, he argued that chokeholds should be mostly banned. If a police officer is in a bad scuffle and he's got somebody, you have to be careful. With that being said, it would be, I think, a very good thing that generally speaking, it should be ended. But it's not just Biden and Trump who are against defunding the police. Indeed, plenty of people to the left of Joe Biden do not support the idea. Stacey Abrams characterized calls to defund the police as presenting a false choice. The founder and host of the Young Turks, Cenk Uygur, echoed Stacey Abrams' perspective, arguing that the slogan is being used to divide the left. He had previously argued that the slogan was bad messaging, tweeting, "Progressive activists have a way of framing things in a way that causes maximum pushback from most Americans. Both abolish ICE and defund the police sound like you're getting rid of all law enforcement. You're not doing that, so I don't know why you want to give off that impression." Whether or not you agree with Uygur on the policy, he's definitely right about the politics, at least for the time being. According to YouGov polling, despite calls by activists and protesters to defund police departments, most Americans do not support reducing law enforcement budgets. Close to 2/3, 65%, oppose cutting police force funding. Just 16% of Democrats and 15% of Republicans support that idea. So it actually seems like most of America is united on this issue. The majority of Americans oppose defunding the police, President Trump does not support it, but supports potential reforms. Joe Biden does not support defunding, but does support reforms. Stacey Abrams doesn't support defunding, but is calling for transformations, as is Cenk Uygur. So that's the Republican president, his Democratic challenger, an influential Georgia progressive, an actual progressive, and a strong majority of Americans all in agreement. The odd group out, then, appears to be a veto-proof majority of Minneapolis City Council, who, responding to calls to defund the police, have decided to totally disband the Minneapolis Police Department. The plan was first announced by City Council President Lisa Bender, who declared, "We're here because here in Minneapolis and in cities across the United States, it is clear that our existing system of policing and public safety is not keeping our communities safe. Our efforts at incremental reform have failed, period." Of course, the dismantling of the Minneapolis Police Department does not mean that the city will have, at the end of its coming period of transition, completely eliminated law enforcement in the city. While City Council has claimed it will have a transformative new model of public safety, it's unclear what exactly that will end up looking like. It's possible that a radically different approach will be adopted. At the same time, I wouldn't be wholly shocked if at the end of the day the city delivers even less than it is vaguely promising, and a new police department ends up being created with few significant structural changes from the previous model. The degree in which the city changes its ways will likely come down to the duration and intensity of public pressure. The uncertainty around what will happen in Minneapolis is reflective of the ambiguity in the call from protesters. According to Philip McHarris, a doctoral candidate at Yale, some supporters of defunding the police want to totally dissolve police departments and strip all police funding. Others want to reallocate some, but not all, police funding to other areas like social services. This is no small difference. Completely dismantling police departments permanently would be a totally unprecedented move, one that is a radical departure from how governments tend to function in modern nation states. Among the most basic functions of a state are the taxation of a population in order to fund the government, defending the territory of a state with a military, creating laws to be universally applied within that territory, and enforcing those laws through courts, a penal system, and law enforcement agencies. That's essentially how we define what a sovereign state is. Perhaps the most influential definition is that of sociologist Max Weber, who in his 1918 lecture, Politics is a Vocation, defined the modern nation state as a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. This is not merely a definitional concern. Completely dismantling the capacity of the state to exercise control through police could potentially create a vacuum of power that might be filled by nefarious actors like organized crime. This scenario is essentially the setup to the 1979 film The Warriors.
Now there ain't but 20,000 police in the whole town. Can you dig it? Can you dig it?
On the other hand, simply decreasing the budget of a police department to fund other programs is by no means a departure from the orthodoxy of political science, nor is it particularly radical when it comes to actual practice. Numerous activists and academics have for decades argued that the US spends too much on law enforcement and not enough on social welfare. Indeed, reducing police budgets goes hand in hand with some changes that plenty of people in the law enforcement community have themselves called for. It would be hard to argue that Dallas Police Chief David Brown is not sympathetic to law enforcement. In 2016, 12 of his officers were shot by a sniper, 5 of which lost their lives. Days later, he spoke of the unfair burden placed on police. Every societal failure, we put it on the cops to solve. Not enough mental health funding? Let the cop handle it. Not enough drug addiction funding? Let's give it to the cops. Here in Dallas, we have a loose dog problem. Let's have the cops chase loose dogs. Schools fail? Give it to the cops. 70% of the African American community is being raised by single women. Let's give it to the cops to solve as well. That's too much to ask. Policing was never meant to solve all those problems. I just ask other parts of our democracy, along with the free press, to help us. Defunding the police partially, but not wholly, would be to do just that. Rather than asking the cops to solve problems they are not meant to solve, funding goes to programs that are designed to solve those problems. In fact, such a program was tested in Dallas the very next year. In 2017, in response to increasing police calls involving people with mental illness, a pilot program, Right Care, was implemented, which put an officer, a paramedic, and a social worker in every car responding to mental health calls in the city's south central region. The change led to a drop in arrests in the area. Dallas, of course, is not the only example of police defunding potentially working. A 2017 report, which focused on the New York Police Department's efforts to pull back on proactive policing in 2014 and 2015, found that these efforts led to fewer major crime complaints. New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof argues that you can also look at Portugal's drug legalization policies as an example of defunding in practice. In the 1990s, both the United States and Portugal were struggling with how to respond to illicit narcotics. The United States doubled down on the policing toolbox, while Portugal followed the advice of experts and decriminalized the possession even of hard drugs. So in 2001, Portugal, to use today's terminology, defunded the police for routine drug cases. Small-time users get help from social workers and access to free methadone from roving trucks. This worked. Not perfectly, but pretty well. As I found when I reported from Portugal a few years ago, the number of heroin users there fell by 3/4, and the overdose fatality rate was the lowest in Western Europe. Meanwhile, after decades of policing, the United States was losing about 70,000 Americans a year from overdoses. In effect, Portugal appeared to be winning the war on drugs by ending it. That's the idea behind Defund the Police, as most conceive it. Not to eliminate every police officer, but to reimagine ways to make us safe that don't necessarily involve traditional law enforcement. Now, even without these examples as evidence, it would seem to me logical to conclude that eliminating or reducing the causes of criminal behavior would reduce the burden that law enforcement must bear. If mental illness causes disturbances that drain police resources, improving mental health treatment can be expected to reduce the problem. And if poverty causes crime, financial assistance can be expected to reduce these crimes. Obviously, assuming that crimes have discernible causes, we ought to consider the possibility that in some cases, it may be more financially efficient to reduce the causes rather than respond to the effects. Those arguing that the Defund the Police slogan creates a false choice may easily argue, why not do both? Why not create new programs to address underlying problems, while at the same time maintaining police budgets where they're at? For one thing, decisions about where municipal funds are allocated is by no means a false choice. It is a very real, practical choice that municipalities have to decide. If you increase spending in one area without slashing the budgets of other areas, you have to raise additional revenue. Generally speaking, this would come from taxes, and municipal taxation can often come in ways that would exacerbate underlying causes of crime, such as poverty. Sales tax is a rather regressive form of taxation, disproportionately affecting the lowest income consumers of goods. Property taxes hurt middle-class homeowners and can be passed on to renters in the form of rent increases. Increasing the enforcement or charges associated with traffic, parking, and other tickets, likewise, tend to be forms of regressive taxation. Since the 1970s, there has already been an increase in these regressive forms of revenue generation for local governments. On top of the funding issue is the fact that it is quite possible that in some circumstances, overly inflated police budgets might themselves be part of the problem. According to research by Princeton professor Jonathan Momolo, police militarization fails to enhance officer safety or reduce local crime, while at the same time eroding public opinion about law enforcement. Of course, the cost of this military equipment is very real. According to PBS, between 1997 and 2014, the Department of Defense transferred $4.3 billion worth of military equipment to local law enforcement agencies. Indeed, overall police budgets have ballooned in major cities, even as crime has often declined. According to a study by Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, which followed 150 cities, back in the late 70s, cities spent on average 6.6% of their funds on police. 40 years later, that has increased to 7.8%. In a study by the Center for Popular Democracy and published by Forbes, the numbers presented appear far more troubling. Looking specifically at general fund expenditures, the study found cities like Oakland and Chicago spent around 40% of these funds on policing in 2017. Now, whichever figures you'd rather fixate on, the pattern is clear. Police budgets are large and increasing, and municipal budgets are just a small piece of a much larger picture. At all levels of government, the United States spends more on law enforcement systems as it does on social services. The total cost of police, prisons, and courts are now over double the cost of temporary assistance, food stamps, and supplemental income. Back in 1970, these costs were roughly the same. America's move toward increasing funding for law enforcement solutions while decreasing its emphasis on social services also puts the country at odds with the rest of the world. Overall, the US spends more on domestic public safety programs than do peer nations. At the same time, the US spends less on social programs than most OECD countries. For instance, while France spends 31.2% of its GDP on social programs and Germany spends 25.1%, the US spends 18.7%. At the same time, America's incarceration rates are higher than any other country on earth where there is data available. The US has twice the incarceration rate of Iran, 6 times that of China, and over 10 times the rate of Sweden. And this, of course, is an expensive proposition. Each incarcerated person costs taxpayers an average of $31,000 per year. Compare this to primary and secondary school students who currently cost taxpayers an average of around $12,000 per year. Clearly, in other countries, the lower prison populations and higher investments in social services have not led to a warrior scenario of utter chaos.
Can you dig it?
Indeed, while violent crime has declined in the United States in recent decades, substantial evidence indicates that the US is still faring poorer in this area than other wealthy nations. One study comparing the crime statistics of 36 countries found that the US rape rate was the 4th highest in the group. Its homicide rate was the 3rd most, behind only Estonia and Mexico. Not surprisingly, that same study also found the US to be the most punitive society, with a model that measures the frequency and intensity of prison sentences.
Can you count, suckers?
And returning to the problem that started this whole conversation in the first place, the way in which America polices its citizens comes with a cost that goes beyond price tag. In 24 years, 55 people were shot dead by the police in England and Wales. In the United States, there were more fatal police shootings in the first 24 days of 2015. Of course, this can't be wholly accounted for by accountants. The issue transcends finance, and defunding police departments is probably not a silver bullet to fix everything wrong with policing in America. Obviously, there are other solutions that must be considered: community policing, methods of creating police accountability, and adapting police training. You'll also notice that I have barely mentioned race. One major reason why I did not want to focus this conversation on George Floyd and the ensuing protests is that I trust, in fact I know and have seen that, the Black community is perfectly capable of speaking for itself. But America's policing problems should not just be thought of as a Black issue or a wedge issue for Trump's re-election campaign. Of course, it disproportionately affects Black people, but it also affects other people of color and poor people and people with mental health or addiction issues. Morally, it affects all Americans. It also directly affects law enforcement officers and officials, and I really do have sympathy for them. It isn't fair for officers to be required to do jobs that they are not trained to do. It isn't fair for society to make a dangerous job more dangerous because of this. And it isn't fair for the hard-working, well-intentioned cops to be loathed by society because far too many murderous thugs have joined their vocation. How does it help police if we don't fix America's policing problem? And while this problem goes far beyond the dollars and cents of municipal budgets, it is indeed a problem that extends into the very fabric of America's government and society as a whole. And when it comes to the way America expresses its values, it was actually an opponent of defunding the police, Joe Biden, who in 2008 said, "Don't tell me what you value. Show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value." So what does it mean for America if that very same Joe Biden and his Republican opponent, and some of the loudest progressive voices and the majority of American people all oppose the idea of defunding the police before they've even had that conversation? And what does it say about America's values if the budgets on all governmental levels currently upholding the status quo of policing in America do not fundamentally change? What exactly does that mean?